Hi guys, I am back with Judges chapter 16. We're looking at verses 1 through 22. And of course, this is a pretty well known story in the Bible. This is Samson and Delilah. Um, so I'm just going to give you my take on it here. So when we get to Judges chapter 16, Samson had already been judging Israel for 20 years. God had taken advantage of his pride and his anger and given him supernatural strength to conquer the enemies of his people, which was the Philistines. And so now, 20 years later, Samson's still reigning, and he again becomes entangled in lust and pride. And I wonder if he ever put those things down at all, but we're told of this particular encounter with lust and pride. So in Judges chapter 16, verse 1, it tells us that Samson went to Gaza and found a prostitute. The Philistines heard that he was in town and surrounded the city gate, lying in wait to ambush him in the morning. So they're still after him after 20 years. Guess they didn't forget about, those foxes and the tails and the fire and him killing all those men. They're still kind of upset about this 20 years later. So they're waiting to ambush him when he gets up from lying with his prostitute. But they had decided to wait until morning, and Samson had decided to leave at midnight. With his supernatural strength, he pulls up the city gate, the actual gate, with his bare hand, and he leaves. He leaves before they get him, okay? So notice, I think this is important. Samson still isn't exactly leading a godly life, and I'm not sure he ever was. Not from what we're told, anyway. So the man is sleeping with a prostitute. I mean, he's not exactly following God in all of his commands. But yet, we also find that God is still, after all these years, still empowering him with this great supernatural strength. And I think that's something we need to consider, because I think what that kind of tells us is that it is very possible to be empowered by God, blessed by God, talented, gifted, given things that God is using in us for a time, while simultaneously living and acting in complete opposition or complete depravity against God's commands. Now that's something we need to kind of think about, because it's a fact. It's a fact, and we can look at Samson and we can point to this fact that God will still use men even when they're walking in opposition to his commands at times. And so it's a fact. I think we need to file it somewhere in the Mysteries of God section or something in our mind, because it's a little bit strange. And, we can file it under, justice delayed. Doesn't mean that justice is subverted. Justice will come. But we also see in Samson's story that God actually is behind Samson's circumstances, and he actually wants these things to go on because he's looking for an opportunity against the Philistines. And so that makes it even more confusing, because we look at Romans 9, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but we look at Romans 9 and we just have to kind of default to what the writer of Romans says when he says, but who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Should what has been molded say to the molder, why did you make me like this, right? That's what we kind of have to default to, because it's a mystery. It's a mystery. So anyway, Samson falls in love again after the prostitute situation. He actually falls in love, not with that prostitute, but with a woman whose name was Delilah. And so everybody could see that Samson really, really liked this one, right? Because he liked women in general, but he loved this woman. And it was kind of obvious, I guess, because the Philistines came to Delilah and they're like, okay, we're going to give you all this money. we're going to bribe you if you can just find out the secret to Samson's strength. We're going to get it out of him, right? So they bribe her, and 3 times Delilah asks Samson his secret, and 3 times he deceives her with false information. And as we know, Samson's strength was in his hair. He had, when his mom became pregnant, and the angel of the Lord came to her and said, "You'll be pregnant." The angel said, "You'll take this vow. You're not allowed to drink alcohol." They had this Nazirite vow, and Samson's hair was never allowed to be cut because of this vow, and so his strength was in his hair. So 3 times Samson deceives Delilah and tells her things that aren't true about where his strength is coming from, and each time she actually carries out the exact measures that he tells her would weaken him. And so if that's not a clue, I mean, as to who this woman was and who he was dealing with, I don't know what would be, right? Love is blind, I guess. But this guy just isn't too bright, right? He can't see that this woman is going to be his demise. She's proven it to him 3 times now. So maybe he's just not too bright. Or maybe, perhaps, Samson had come to a point where he no longer believed that God was relevant at all for him and his strength. Perhaps he believed his strength was his own. Maybe he believed that maybe his pride had led him to a place where it had taken him to a point where he had completely forgotten his need and his dependence upon the God who called him from birth. That's very possible, and that's my guess, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't know. I mean, yes, love is blind, but I don't know how you could be that stupid. When someone intentionally deceives you 3 times, or tries to weaken you 3 times, I don't know. Because no one's that dumb, right? No one's that stupid. I don't know. Maybe he was just a big dumb oaf, but I don't know. So finally, Delilah wears him down to the point she's so pleased and begs, and he finally tells her his secret. His strength is in his hair. I feel like Rapunzel here. All right. Delilah cuts his hair and calls his enemies. Now tell me he didn't realize that was going to happen. How could he have not, right? I think he knew she was going to try it. Maybe he wanted to try. Maybe he wanted to see if it was just his strength. I don't know. But she cuts his hair. She calls his enemies. She gets her payment, right? Just like Judas and Jesus. He gets his payment, betrays Jesus. And so when Samson awakens, and she was sneaky about it too. She makes him go to sleep on her lap, probably stroking his long hair. I love you so much. And then she cuts it off and he's attacked by her people. So when he wakes up, he's under attack. And again, he mistakenly thinks this time he's going to overpower them with his great strength, just like every other time. But Judges 16:20 is the key to the whole thing. It says, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. He didn't know. How could he have not known? But how tragic. He did not know that the Lord had left him. And that verse tells us quite a number of things. It tells us, A, that the Lord may be with us for quite a time. I mean, Samson was probably, in his 40s at this point, and he had gone through his entire life with the blessing of God. He had gone through his entire life being empowered with the strength and just the leadership. God had given him so much his whole life. But at this point, God leaves. He leaves Samson. The strength leaves Samson. Okay, the Spirit of God leaves from Samson's body and his being. And so that tells us that we can go through almost our whole life with the favor of God. And then one day, after all of our sin, and not repenting and thinking we're self-sufficient, we can do it ourselves, just like Samson, God may leave us. He may leave us to our own devices. And the Bible tells us that as well. Romans 1 and 2, I believe, tell us things along those lines. God will let us have our sin if we'll not repent of it. And so I think that's a very important thing we need to note here in this Old Testament story. So, why didn't Samson know that the Lord had left him, or even that the Lord would leave him? Why didn't he know that? I mean, he was raised, with this vow and everything. He knew the ways of God. He was taught them. And I think, speculating here, it was because he had so long forgotten and ignored the Lord's presence, the Lord's power, not his own, the Lord's position over him, and the Lord's commands to him. He had so long ignored those things, doing what he wanted, being the big man on campus all the time, not having consequences really for it. Although he did when he lost his first wife, right, out of his pride. But anyway, Samson thought he was God. He must have. He thought he was the one who was strong. He thought he was the one who was invincible. Samson wasn't thinking much about God, at least at this point in time. And it sounds to me like a lot of professing Christians today. Yeah, they say, oh, I love God, or I know God, or, they'll profess belief, when it's socially acceptable. But at the end of the day, they have no concern for God's commands, no concern for God's power, God's position over them, like no concern for his word or to know it. Like, I mean, you can go through your whole life like that, professing belief, but you know what? If you don't really know God or try to know God, or you don't follow his commands, don't ever repent, you're not a Christian, okay? If you're not thinking about God on a daily basis, if you're not considering what he would have you to do, if you're just living into your own stuff all day, every day, like Samson seemed to be doing here, don't be surprised if one day God's Spirit does leave, and there are many consequences for your actions, because sin never leaves us without suffering, right? We're going to suffer when we sin. And Samson did, and we can see that here. So finally, after a long life of self-indulgent strength and victory, might I add, he was a winner, he was winning, right? Samson loses, right? He loses. He loses his strength. He loses his fight with his enemies. He loses the woman he actually truly loved. He loses both his eyes. I mean, that's a terrible thing, right? Who wants to get their eyes gouged out? But that's what happens when they attack him. He loses his freedom, right? They lock him up in prison. Samson loses pretty much everything. And so we need to think, just because justice is delayed in our life or in others' lives, when we sin, it does not mean justice is subverted, right? Justice will be done one way or another. And so if we repent, while today is the day of salvation, if we repent of sin, then Jesus Christ pays for the justice that we deserve, right, on the cross. And we accept that. But if we'll not repent, then at some point in time, whether it be this life or the next, justice is going to be served. Justice is going to be done for the sins we have committed, and we all have them. So somewhere along the way, justice is going to be done. So anyway, to sum it up here in this passage, God used Samson's sin and orchestrated even Samson's circumstances in order to accomplish his own purposes with the Philistines and his people. And some would call that unfair. I think it's a little confusing, but hey, God can do what he wants. He's God. I'm just going by what the text is telling us. These are the facts of what happened. But in Romans 9:20, the writer tells us, but who are you? Who am I? Who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Well, what is molded? Say to its molder, why have you made me like this? And the answer is clearly a rhetorical no. We cannot talk back to God. He does as he wishes, and his word is true, and so we need to submit to it, right? What we know for sure is that loss Great loss is at the end of self-sufficiency. It's at the end of pride. It's at the end of lust. It's at the end of unbridled anger. Those are the things that Samson displayed throughout his life. And at the end of those things, no matter how much you may win, and no matter how long you may be winning for, at the end of those actions is always suffering. It's always loss, and it's always defeat. So unless we repent and accept Christ's sacrifice and Christ, his payment for those things that we have done, we're going to pay those consequences. So that's the story of Samson and Delilah. God's still not quite finished with Samson just yet, because God is a God of mercy and grace. And so even after all of these wrong actions, all of this sin, God is going to redeem Samson in a way, in his death. And so it's a little bit of a difficult, I think, story to understand. Samson's whole life, I think, is a difficult biblical passage to understand, but I think it does tell us some things about God, his character, and the wisdom that we need to just submit to. We don't always understand everything about God. If we did, we'd be God, right? So I guess next time we will conclude Judges chapter 16 and see what happens in Samson's death. Thanks for listening. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you later.